beginning of an era. British Midland Flight 92. On the morning of January 8, 1989, a British Midland Boeing 737-400 departed from Heathrow Airport, London, on its routine journey to Belfast. There were 118 passengers and 8 crew members on board. It was a short domestic flight, lasting only about an hour, and the weather was perfectly normal. Everything was peaceful, like hundreds of other flights departing Heathrow every day. But just minutes after leaving the runway, it would become one of the most thoroughly studied accidents in modern aviation history. Sitting in the cockpit were 2 highly experienced pilots, Captain Kevin Hunt, 43, with over 13,000 flight hours, and First Officer David McLelland, 39, with approximately 3,000 flight hours. They were both competent and highly regarded within the airline. However, they shared one commonality. They had both just transitioned to flying the Boeing 737-400, the newest variant of the 737 series, and did not have much actual time on this aircraft type. They received their conversion training in a short period, based on the assumption that anyone who had flown the older 737 could easily master the 737-400. On paper, that sounded reasonable, but in reality, the 737-400 was a different generation. The display system in the cockpit had completely changed, using electronic screens instead of the old mechanical dials. Some information was arranged in different positions, and the way it was displayed was no longer familiar. These differences seemed small, but in moments of emergency, they could lead people to make the wrong decisions. British Midland Flight 92 took off smoothly from London. No one knew that the combination of confidence, lack of training, and a change in technology, 3 factors that often go unnoticed, would soon create a chain of errors leading to disaster. The 737-400 and the training gap. When British Midland received its first Boeing 737-400s, the airline saw it as a major step forward, an aircraft line advertised as more modern, more fuel-efficient, and more pilot-friendly. But hidden behind that modern facade was a critical change in the cockpit that no one truly paid attention to. Instead of traditional mechanical dials, the 737-400 was equipped with CRT electronic screens displaying engine and system information. For Boeing, this was a new technology that made it easier for pilots to grasp. Therefore, the company assumed that those accustomed to flying the old 737 could adapt on their own, without the need for in-depth simulator training. In theory, this saved training costs and time. But in practice, the minor differences in display and system reaction could create a deadly gap. Not a single person in the British Midland 92 flight crew had ever experienced an emergency situation on this electronic cockpit. They had never been instructed on how to recognize when the screen displayed incorrect information or when the engine sensor signaled an anomaly. When a new system is introduced, it demands not only technique, but also a deep understanding of the aircraft's behavior in abnormal situations. But in 1989, the aviation industry still carried the mindset that, if the old one flew, the new one will fly too. That was a dangerous assumption, and for British Midland Flight 92, it was about to come at the cost of real lives. The mid-air incident. Just 15 minutes after leaving London, the British Midland 737-400 was cruising steadily at 28,000 feet when everything changed in an instant. A loud bang echoed from the rear of the fuselage, followed by severe vibration. A flash of fire erupted from the left engine, clear enough for some passengers to see through the windows. In the cockpit, a smoky odor spread quickly, a typical sign that the engine was experiencing a serious malfunction. Captain Kevin Hunt and First Officer David McLelland had to react immediately in those first few seconds
where every decision was life or death.
Engine failed.
The gauges on the new electronic screen began displaying abnormal data, but it was here that the design of the 737-400 and the inadequate training started to reveal weaknesses. The new display system made it difficult for the pilots to accurately identify which engine was failing. There was no distinct strong vibration at the control column, and the sound in the cockpit was not very helpful. When they quickly checked the indicators, the right engine appeared to be acting erratically, but that was merely a false indication due to a sensor signal. Both pilots believed the right engine was the source of the problem, when in reality, the left engine was the one on fire. This was the moment when a sequence of small deviations began to stack up. New technology, unrealistic training, and a genuine emergency, all converging at an altitude of nearly 9,000 meters. In the next few minutes, their decision would determine the fate of the aircraft and the over 100 people on board.
The deadly engine confusion. In the chaotic moment, at 28,000 feet, everything happened very fast. First Officer David McClellan looked at the control panel and saw the abnormal vibration indicator. Based on his experience with previous 737 models, the gauge's position suggested the right engine was having an issue. But on the new 737-400, this layout had been changed. The strong vibration signal actually originated from the left engine, the one on fire. Captain Kevin Hunt trusted his colleagues' assessment. In the cockpit environment, when an emergency occurs, trust and coordinated reflex are the decisive factors. Hunt immediately followed the familiar procedure. Reduce the thrust of the right engine to isolate the source of vibration. But that was the only engine still operating normally. In a few seconds, they had just shut down the sole source of power, helping the plane maintain altitude. The electronic indicators on the CRT screen displayed data that neither person was completely familiar with. The display system did not clearly warn that they were shutting down the wrong engine. No one in the cockpit looked out the left window to confirm the engine status, something that might have been emphasized in simulator training had they ever practiced it. When the left engine truly began to burn, the fuel system automatically cut off most of the flames, making the crew even more certain that they had handled the situation correctly. Meanwhile, the 737 continued to gradually lose altitude, relying on a single engine, but that was the engine they had just disabled. This seemingly small error was quietly steering the aircraft toward an irreversible disaster. The false signal and mistaken confirmation. When the captain reduced the thrust on the right engine, the 737-400 gradually stabilized. The vibration disappeared, and the smoky odor in the cabin also faded. For the crew, that was a clear sign that they had done the right thing. They believed the failed engine had been dealt with, and the plane was now flying safely on the remaining engine. In reality, they had just disabled the only operational power source, while the left engine, the one that had exploded earlier, was still smoldering inside. On the electronic screen, the indicators seemed to reinforce that mistaken belief. Both engines were at a low power setting, with no red warnings, no strong vibrations. The 737-400's warning system was not designed to clearly differentiate in a case where both engines reduced power simultaneously. That plunged the cockpit into a state of false quiet. No more alarms, no more shaking, but also no real thrust. During the emergency procedure, the pilots did not visually inspect the engines through the window, a basic step in an engine fire situation. The reason was not due to complacency, but because the prior training process had never emphasized direct verification when the electronic data was considered clear enough. They relied on technology, trusted the screens, and ignored their practical senses. A few minutes later, as the 737 began to descend for an emergency approach to East Midlands Airport, everything still seemed fine. But inside the casing of the left engine, the blades were broken, fuel was still leaking, and the fire had never fully gone out. A small technical error was now compounded by mistaken confirmation, and its consequence was about to become irretrievable. Diverting to East Midland. When everything in the cockpit appeared to be stable, Captain Kevin Hunt decided to divert to East Midlands Airport, the closest suitable option for an emergency landing. He believed the 737 was operating on only one engine, but that it was enough to bring the plane down safely. No one in the flight crew knew that the remaining engine was actually severely damaged, and that they had mistakenly shut down the one that was working fine. On the approach, the pilots contacted air traffic control, reporting a one-engine failure situation and requesting emergency assistance. The runway was cleared and fire trucks were in position. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, those sitting on the left side could still see fire and smoke coming from the engine, along with the smell of burning fuel. But because the aircraft was maintaining a stable altitude, no one thought the situation was far worse than what they heard over the intercom. The 737-400 continued to fly with one engine almost completely non-operational. The parameters in the cockpit, pressure, temperature, rotational speed, remained within acceptable limits, partly because the electronic display system was not designed to clearly reflect the gradual signs of degradation in the failing engine. The captain trusted that data, maintaining a speed of about 190 knots and gradually reducing altitude. When the plane was about 15 miles from East Midlands Airport, everything was still eerily quiet. But just minutes later, the fire in the left engine flared up again. Without enough thrust to maintain altitude, the aircraft began to lose speed rapidly. In the cockpit, both pilots still believed they were on the way to a safe return, but in reality, they were flying the 737 with neither engine truly operational.
The door to tragedy. As the Boeing 737-400 approached East Midlands Airport, everything seemed to be under control. Captain Kevin Hunt believed his aircraft still had one engine operating steadily, enough to bring them safely to the runway. But in just a few short minutes, that belief collapsed. The left engine, which was actually the only one still operating, began to lose thrust, then shut down completely. Without the lift to maintain altitude, the 737 quickly fell into a desperate situation. The plane lost altitude too quickly, beyond the capacity for control. On the ground, people on the M1 highway did not know that an aircraft was plunging straight towards them. A few seconds later, the 737 hit the ground at a steep angle, shattering into pieces. The fuselage slid across a field and burst into a fierce fire. 47 people died, and many others were severely injured. The subsequent investigation pointed to a rare chain of errors. The pilots had mistakenly shut down the healthy engine, while the genuinely damaged engine continued to burn. The root cause stemmed from a lack of understanding of the new display system on the 737-400 series. The more modern electronic equipment was not as intuitive as the older type that the pilots were accustomed to. Furthermore, the type conversion training for pilots lasted only a few hours, insufficient to recognize the critical differences between the two generations of aircraft. The British Midland Flight 92 tragedy was not just the consequence of one wrong decision in a single moment, but the result of the gap between new technology and people who had not yet caught up. A small error in judgment, and an entire flight lost its chance of survival.